chandeliers of Ashworth House blazed with 1,000 candles, their light cascading over the cream and gold of London's finest ballroom like liquid amber, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with the heat of bodies pressed together in their silken finery, the rustle of gowns, and the murmur of 100 conversations, creating a symphony of privilege and expectation. Outside, beyond the tall windows draped in velvet the color of midnight, storm clouds gathered in the June sky, their darkness a strange counterpoint to the brilliance within, though none of the assembled guests seemed to notice or care. They were here, after all, for the spectacle, for the careful dance of alliance and ambition that was the London season at its height, and at the center of it all, moving through the crowd with the effortless command of a man who had never questioned his place in the world, was His Grace, the Duke of Ashworth. He was 30 years of age, possessed of the classical handsomeness that seemed almost carved from marble-sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, dark hair swept back from a high forehead, and eyes of such pale grey they appeared almost silver in the candlelight. Everything about him spoke of absolute control, from the perfect knot of his cravat to the measured pace of his steps, from the way he inclined his head in acknowledgement, without ever quite smiling, to the manner in which his gaze swept the room, assessing, cataloguing, dismissing. They called him unconquerable. Those who whispered in the corners and behind their fans, a man who had inherited his title at 20 and had spent the decade since turning the Ashworth estates into a model of efficiency and profit, who sat in the House of Lords and spoke rarely, but was always heeded, who had never shown weakness or indecision, or any emotion stronger than mild displeasure. He had decided, this very evening before the ball began, that it was time to secure his duchy's future, and as his gaze settled upon Miss Eleanor Hartley where she stood near the refreshment table, a young woman of 23 with chestnut hair arranged in simple elegance and a gown of pale blue that spoke of good taste rather than ostentation, he felt the same certainty he brought to every decision. She was perfect, her bloodline impeccable, her dowry respectable though not excessive, her comportment always proper, her reputation unblemished by even a whisper of scandal. More importantly, she was quiet, retiring, the sort of woman who would manage his household with competence and provide him with heirs without demanding the messy entanglement of emotion that he had long ago determined was a weakness he could not afford. He watched her for a moment, noting the way she stood slightly apart from the other young ladies, her posture correct but somehow distant, and he approved of this reserve, this lack of desperate ambition. She would accept his proposal with gratitude and grace, he was certain, for what woman would refuse to become a duchess, to have every material comfort, every social advantage? As he began to move toward her with the inevitability of a man who had never been denied, he did not notice the way her gloved hand tightened around the ivory sticks of her fan until her knuckles showed white against the silk, did not see the brief flicker of something in her brown eyes that might have been recognition or resignation, or perhaps a quiet species of dread. The storm outside pressed closer to the windows, thunder rumbling low and distant, like a warning no one chose to hear. The Duke crossed the ballroom floor with the measured confidence of a man who had never known refusal, and the crowd seemed to part before him as naturally as water before the prow of a great ship, their conversations faltering and resuming in his wake, for everyone recognized that particular quality of intention in his movements. He reached Miss Eleanor Hartley just as she set down her glass of lemonade, and when he bowed with perfect precision and requested a private word, she had no choice but to nod her acquiescence, though something in her eyes flickered like a candle in a draught. He led her to a relatively quiet corner of the ballroom, where they might be seen by all but overheard by none, which was precisely as he had planned it, for a public proposal carried with it the weight of social expectation, made refusal nearly impossible without causing scandal. "Miss Hartley," he began, his voice carrying that particular timbre of authority that had served him so well in Parliament and in business. "I have observed you throughout the season, and I find your comportment, your breeding, and your character to be entirely suitable to the position of Duchess of Ashworth." He did not notice how her spine straightened almost imperceptibly, how her chin lifted by perhaps a quarter of an inch. "It is my intention to marry before the year's end, and I believe we would suit admirably. Your family would benefit from the alliance, as would mine through the addition of your impeccable lineage. I am prepared to settle a generous sum upon you, and to ensure that you want for nothing in terms of material comfort or social position." He paused, waiting for her gratitude, her blushing acceptance, perhaps even tears of joy. And the room around them had gone still as those nearest strained to hear, as the realization of what was occurring spread through the ballroom like ripples across a pond. Eleanor Hartley stood before him in her pale blue gown, and for a long moment she was utterly motionless, so still that she might have been carved from the same marble his features resembled, and in that stillness the entire assembly seemed to hold its collective breath. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear, each word enunciated with a precision that matched his own. "Your Grace, I am sensible of the honor you do me, but I must decline your proposal." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, and for perhaps 3 heartbeats no one moved, no one breathed, as if the very chandeliers might crash down from the shock of it. The Duke's expression did not change. He was far too well trained for that, but something in his pale eyes went flat and hard, like winter ice forming over a deep lake. "I beg your pardon," he said, and though his tone remained controlled, there was steel beneath the silk. "I must respectfully decline," Eleanor repeated, and then she executed a curtsy of such perfect form that it could not be faulted, even as it served as dismissal. And before he could gather himself to respond, before he could process what had just occurred, she had turned and was moving through the crowd with a grace that bordered on flight, leaving him standing alone in the center of the ballroom's attention. The murmur that arose was like the buzzing of 1,000 bees, shock and speculation, and barely concealed delight at such unprecedented drama. And the Duke stood there, feeling as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet, feeling something he could not immediately name, because he had so little experience with it. The hot, churning mixture of fury and disbelief and wounded pride that masqueraded, even to himself, as mere indifference. "She refused me," his mind repeated with each beat of his heart. "She refused me." It was impossible, inconceivable, an affront to the natural order of things, and as he finally moved, walking from the ballroom with the same measured pace he had entered, though it cost him every ounce of will he possessed, he told himself that he felt nothing but contempt for her foolishness, that he was relieved to have discovered her lack of sense before binding himself to her. But beneath that carefully constructed indifference, beneath the mask of aristocratic composure, something darker coiled and tightened, the first bitter taste of a lesson he had never thought he would need to learn. The storm that had threatened during the ball broke that very night, rain lashing against windows throughout London, as if the heavens themselves were scandalized, and by morning the news of Miss Eleanor Hartley's refusal of the Duke of Ashworth had spread through every drawing room, every breakfast table, every corner, where society gathered to dissect the extraordinary and the unprecedented. The whispers were everywhere, speculation running wild. Perhaps she was secretly engaged to another, perhaps she had lost her senses, perhaps there was some hidden scandal the Duke had discovered and withdrawn his suit in truth, allowing her the fiction of refusal to preserve her reputation. In his ancestral estate of Ashworth Park, to which he had retreated with cold dignity the morning after the ball, the Duke moved through the vast halls like a ghost of himself, his fury carefully banked behind walls of ice, refusing to speak of the matter, throwing himself into his correspondence and estate business with an intensity that made his steward nervous and his servants walk on tiptoe. He told himself he did not care, that he was well rid of a woman so foolish as to refuse the position he had offered, that there were a dozen other suitable young ladies who would accept him with proper gratitude, and yet he found himself unable to settle, unable to focus, the memory of her quiet refusal playing over and over in his mind like a musical phrase that would not resolve. Meanwhile, in the significantly more modest townhouse of the Hartley family, Eleanor sat in the morning room while her father paced and her younger sister wept, both of them unable to comprehend what she had done, why she would refuse such a brilliant match, such security, such elevation. "But Eleanor," her sister kept saying, her voice rising toward hysteria, "he is a duke, the Duke of Ashworth, and you refused him. You will be ruined. No one else will offer for you now. You will die a spinster, and it will reflect on all of us." Her father, a baronet of modest means, whose estate was entailed away from his daughters, simply looked bewildered and wounded, as if she had struck him without cause. Eleanor sat with her hands folded in her lap, the same composure she had shown in the ballroom now serving as her armor, and when she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. "I could not accept him, Papa. I know you do not understand, but I observed him throughout the season, watched how he spoke to servants as if they were furniture, how he looked at people as if calculating their worth in ledgers, how absolutely certain he was of his own superiority in all things. He did not offer me marriage. He offered me a position, as one might hire a particularly suitable housekeeper. She paused, her throat tight with emotion she would not allow to show. He looked at me and saw breeding stock and proper comportment, not a person with thoughts and feelings and dreams of her own. I would have spent my life invisible in my own home, moving through those grand rooms like a well-dressed ghost, producing heirs and managing his household, and never, ever being seen. Her father opened his mouth to protest, to argue about duty and practicality and the realities of their world. But something in her eyes stopped him, some quiet steel he had not known his daughter possessed. Eleanor knew what her refusal would cost her. She was 23, not a first-season debutante, and to refuse a duke was to mark oneself as impossibly particular or perhaps slightly mad, either of which would end any hope of another suitable offer. She had resigned herself to spinsterhood in the moment she spoke those words of refusal, had accepted the consequence even as her heart hammered with fear of the future, of dependence on her brother's charity when her father passed, of slow fading into the background of other people's lives. But even knowing all of this, even facing the narrowing of her world to the size of a companion's room in some relative's house, she could not regret her choice, for she had seen in the Duke's pale eyes something that chilled her more than any prospect of poverty, the absolute certainty that he owned not just his estates and his title, but anyone who entered his sphere, and she had chosen freedom over gilded captivity, chosen truth over comfort, chosen herself over everything society said a woman should want. 3 weeks passed like 3 years in the library of Ashworth Park, where the Duke found himself unable to settle to any task for more than a few minutes at a time, his attention splintering and scattering, no matter how he tried to impose his usual iron discipline upon his thoughts. He sat in the leather chair his father had occupied before him, surrounded by first editions and family histories and meticulous records of estate management, and found that none of it could hold his interest, for his mind kept returning with obsessive precision to those few moments in the ballroom, to the look in Eleanor Hartley's eyes just before she refused him, to the quiet certainty in her voice when she declined what any sensible woman would have accepted with gratitude. He told himself it was merely wounded pride, that his ego had been bruised by the unprecedented experience of refusal and would heal given time, that soon he would laugh at the entire incident and move forward with selecting a more suitable, more grateful bride from the many who would certainly welcome his addresses. But the reassurances rang hollow even in his own mind, and he found himself pacing the library at odd hours, staring out windows at grounds he barely saw, consumed by a question that grew more insistent with each passing day. Why did her opinion of him matter so much? Why could he not simply dismiss her as foolish and move on? Why did the memory of her quiet words cut deeper than any insult or criticism he had ever received? He began, almost against his will, to examine the certainties he had never before questioned, to wonder if perhaps there had been something in her refusal beyond mere caprice or poor judgment, and this wondering frightened him more than he cared to admit, for his entire world was built upon the foundation of his own rightness, his own superiority, his own absolute conviction in the natural order of things. The Duke had always prided himself on his ability to analyze problems logically, to gather information and make decisions based on facts rather than feelings. And so he approached the puzzle of Eleanor Hartley with the same methodical precision he would bring to a complex business negotiation, telling himself that he merely needed to understand her reasoning in order to dismiss it properly, that knowledge would bring closure and allow him to forget her. He tasked his man of business with a discreet inquiry into Miss Hartley's habits and whereabouts, framing it as idle curiosity rather than the consuming need it had become. And when the report came back, detailing her movements, her morning walks, her charitable visits, her frequent trips to an unfashionable bookshop in Bloomsbury, he felt a surge of something he refused to name as triumph. The bookshop, his investigator noted, was owned by an elderly scholar and carried an unusual selection of philosophical and literary works, quite unsuitable for a young lady's light reading, and Miss Hartley had been observed there at least twice weekly for the past several months, often staying for an hour or more, sometimes leaving with packages of books that she carried herself rather than sending a servant to collect. The Duke sat with this information, turning it over in his mind like a chess player contemplating an unexpected move from his opponent, and gradually a plan formed itself, born of wounded pride and genuine curiosity, and something deeper he would not yet acknowledge. He would arrange to encounter her at this bookshop, would engage her in conversation on neutral ground, would discover what fatal flaw in his character or proposal had led to her refusal, and then, armed with this knowledge, he would finally be able to put the entire mortifying episode behind him and return to his orderly, controlled existence. The decision made, he felt a curious mixture of anticipation and unease, as if he were about to step off solid ground onto ice whose thickness he could not judge. But he pushed the unease aside with the same force of will that had served him so well throughout his life, and made arrangements to visit London the following week, telling himself that this was merely the closing of an irritating chapter, never suspecting that he was instead opening the first page of a story that would rewrite everything he thought he knew about himself. The bookshop stood wedged between a tailor's establishment and a modest tea room on a street that no member of the ton would ordinarily have reason to visit, its weathered sign reading, "Blackwell's Books and Philosophy," in fading gold letters that spoke of better days. And when the Duke pushed open the door on a grey Thursday afternoon, a small bell chimed overhead, and the scent of old paper, leather bindings, and dust motes suspended in slanting autumn light enveloped him like a warm embrace he had not known he needed. The interior was a labyrinth of overstuffed shelves that reached toward a ceiling darkened by years of coal smoke, narrow aisles barely wide enough for two people to pass, the books stacked in precarious towers on every available surface. And in the back corner, illuminated by a shaft of pale sunlight from a high window, stood Eleanor Hartley in a simple day dress of dove grey, her gloves removed and lying forgotten on a nearby chair, her attention utterly absorbed by a volume she held with careful reverence, and the Duke felt his carefully rehearsed greeting die on his lips as he observed her in this unguarded moment. She looked entirely different here than she had in any ballroom, the reserve and careful composure replaced by something luminous and alive, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth as she read, one hand absently reaching up to tuck a wayward curl behind her ear, and he found himself rooted to the spot, like a boy seeing something beautiful and rare that he knew would flee if he moved too quickly. An elderly proprietor appeared from behind a curtain, acknowledged the Duke with a scholar's distracted nod that showed no particular deference to rank, and returned to his cataloguing, leaving the Duke to navigate the narrow aisles toward where Eleanor stood, his heart beating with an unfamiliar rhythm that might have been anxiety or anticipation, or both. She sensed his presence before he spoke, her head lifting with the alertness of a deer in a forest, and when her eyes met his, he saw surprise flash across her features, followed immediately by something that looked almost like disappointment, as if he had intruded upon a sanctuary she had believed safe from his world. "Your Grace," she said, her voice carrying none of the warmth he had heard in it just moments ago when she had been alone with her books, and she set down the volume she had been reading with careful precision, as if using the action to compose herself, to rebuild the walls he had glimpsed her without. "Miss Hartley," he replied, and heard the stiffness in his own voice, the formality that was both armor and habit, and he hated how false it sounded in this warm, dusty space where pretense seemed obscene. "I did not expect to find you here." It was a lie, and they both knew it, and he saw something flicker in her eyes that might have been amusement or contempt. "Did you not?" she asked, her tone perfectly polite and utterly empty of belief. How remarkable, then, that you should venture to this particular establishment, so far from Mayfair, on this particular afternoon. He had the grace to feel embarrassed, heat rising in his collar, and for a moment they stood in silence while dust motes drifted between them like tiny constellations. "I have heard," he began again, abandoning the pretense because her clear gaze made dishonesty impossible, "that this shop carries an exceptional selection of philosophical works." She regarded him steadily, weighing something he could not name, and then she reached past him, her sleeve brushing his arm with an accidental intimacy that sent an unexpected shock through him, and plucked a slim volume from a nearby shelf. "Then perhaps you might benefit from this one," she said, holding it out to him, and he took it automatically, reading the title embossed in faded gold. "On Humility and the Limits of Certainty." The words struck him like a slap, their implication clear and cutting, and he felt his jaw tighten with familiar defensiveness, the instinct to dismiss and diminish, rising swift and sure. But before he could speak, before he could retreat into the icy superiority that had always protected him, he looked at her face and saw, not cruelty there, but something almost like sadness, as if she had expected better of him and been disappointed, and the realization that her good opinion mattered more than his own pride shocked him into silence. "Thank you," he heard himself say, the words emerging stiff and formal but sincere. "I shall purchase it." She nodded, already turning back to her own browsing, dismissing him as one might dismiss a servant who had completed an errand, and he stood there with the book in his hands, feeling foolish and young, and strangely exhilarated, watching as she ran her fingers along the spines of a row of poetry collections with the same tender attention another woman might give to silk or jewels, and he understood with sudden, uncomfortable clarity that he was witnessing someone in the presence of what they truly loved, and that she had never, would never, look at him that way. The Duke read the book that night in his study, the fire burning low and casting shadows that seemed to mock his certainty, and with each page he felt something uncomfortable stirring in his chest, a recognition he did not want but could not deny, for the philosopher's words about the tyranny of absolute conviction and the courage required to admit one's own fallibility seemed written specifically to expose every foundation upon which he had built his sense of self. He found himself remembering moments he had long since dismissed or justified, the way he had cut short a footman's explanation about a broken vase, assuming incompetence rather than asking about circumstances, the manner in which he had overruled his steward's suggestion about crop rotation without truly listening to the reasoning, the countless times he had made pronouncements about art or literature or human nature without considering that his perspective might be limited rather than universal, and these memories accumulated like small cuts, none fatal alone but together drawing blood from his pride. Sleep eluded him that night, and for several nights after, and he found himself wandering the portrait gallery at Ashworth Park, studying the faces of his ancestors with new eyes, wondering if they too had confused certainty with wisdom, control with strength, and whether the rigid perfection he had always strived to embody was truly nobility or merely fear, dressed in ermine and silk. A fortnight later, having learned through discreet inquiry that Miss Hartley frequented the British Museum on Wednesday afternoons, he arranged to find himself studying the Elgin marbles at precisely the hour she typically visited, and when she appeared in the gallery devoted to ancient sculpture, he felt his pulse quicken with an anticipation he told himself was merely the satisfaction of a plan executed well. She saw him immediately, of course, and he watched something like resignation cross her features before she approached with that same quiet composure that both frustrated and fascinated him. "Your Grace," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "I begin to suspect that London is smaller than I had previously imagined, or else your interests have become remarkably aligned with my own." He had prepared a response, something witty and deflecting. But what emerged instead was honesty. "I find myself drawn to beauty I had previously overlooked, Miss Hartley, and seeking to understand perspectives I once would have dismissed without consideration." She studied him for a long moment, her grey eyes searching his face for something he hoped she might find, and then she turned to regard the marble figure beside them, a headless Nike frozen in eternal forward motion. "These sculptures were once whole," she said softly, "painted in brilliant colors, full of life and imperfection, but we admire them now in their broken state, preferring the pure white marble to what they actually were, the fantasy to the truth." He understood she was speaking of more than ancient art, and the implication stung even as it struck true. "And what is the truth you believe I prefer to ignore, Miss Hartley?" he asked, and heard something new in his own voice, a genuine question rather than a challenge. "That true beauty requires vulnerability, not perfection," she replied, still looking at the statue rather than at him. "That the most exquisite moments in art, in nature, in human connection, can come from acknowledging our incompleteness rather than pretending to be marble gods above mortal failing." The words settled over him like snow, cold and inevitable, and he wanted to argue, to defend himself with logic and examples and all the weapons of rhetoric he had always wielded so effectively. But instead he found himself asking, his voice barely above a whisper, "And if one has spent a lifetime constructing armor against such vulnerability, Miss Hartley, how does one begin to set it aside?" She turned to him then, and in her eyes he saw not triumph at his admission, but something that looked almost like compassion, and it terrified him more than her disdain ever could. The pattern established itself over the following weeks like rain wearing channels in stone, inevitable and persistent, for wherever Eleanor appeared, the lending library on Tuesday mornings, the small gallery near Covent Garden that featured works by unknown artists, the quiet garden square where she sometimes sat with a book, when the weather permitted, the Duke of Ashworth would materialize with a coincidence so implausible that it became almost comical, and on a grey afternoon in late October, when Eleanor found him studying the same botanical specimens she had come to sketch at Kew Gardens, she finally turned to him with an expression that mingled exasperation with something that might have been reluctant amusement, and said, her voice gentle but firm, "Your Grace, I confess I am curious whether you have developed a sudden passion for horticulture, medieval manuscripts, landscape painting, and orphaned literature, or whether you are following me with a determination that would be flattering were it not so transparent." He had the grace to look discomfited, color rising in his cheeks in a way she had never witnessed before. This man who commanded rooms with his mere presence, now caught like a schoolboy in an obvious deception, and after a moment's internal struggle, she could see play across his features. He abandoned pretense entirely and said, "I wish to understand, Miss Hartley, why you refused me, and I find I cannot do so from a distance, cannot penetrate the mystery of it through logic or reason, or any of the tools I have always relied upon to comprehend the world." She regarded him steadily, these grey eyes that saw too much and forgave too little, and then she gestured to a bench beneath an ancient oak, whose leaves were surrendering to autumn in shades of amber and rust, and when they were seated she turned to face him with a directness that made him feel exposed in ways no battlefield or political negotiation ever had. "You proposed an arrangement, Your Grace," she said quietly, each word chosen with the precision of a surgeon making necessary incisions. "Not a partnership. You offered position, not presence. You asked me to fill a role in the perfect life you had constructed, but you never once asked who I was beyond my suitability for that role, never wondered what I might want or fear or dream, never considered that I might prefer truth and connection to all the glittering emptiness of being a duchess to a man who would never truly see me." The words struck him with the force of revelation and accusation combined, and his first instinct was defensiveness, the familiar armor of logic and justification rising swift and sure. Had he not been honest about his requirements? Had she not understood the nature of such arrangements? Did she not realize the honor he had offered? But before these protests could form into speech, he looked at her face and saw not triumph there but sadness, a weary resignation that suggested she had expected exactly this response and been disappointed by its predictability, and the realization that he was confirming her lowest assessment of him cut deeper than any insult ever could. They sat in silence while the wind moved through the oak's branches overhead and scattered leaves around their feet like fallen expectations, and he felt something shifting inside him, some certainty he had clung to his entire life beginning to crack and crumble, until finally he said, his voice rough with unfamiliar emotion, "And if I wished now to know who you are, Miss Hartley, not what you might be to me, but who you truly are, would you permit me that knowledge?" Before she could answer, the sky opened with sudden autumn rain, fat drops that quickly became a deluge, and they ran together toward the shelter of a nearby greenhouse, arriving breathless and laughing despite themselves, the spontaneity of it breaking through the formality that usually constrained their interactions. And in that glass-walled sanctuary fragrant with earth and growing things, with rain drumming overhead and mist rising from the warm soil, Eleanor told him about her mother who had died when she was 12, a woman who had valued authenticity above all things and had taught her daughter that a life lived in pretense was no life at all. And the Duke listened, truly listened, feeling each word rearrange something fundamental in his understanding of what it meant to be seen, to be known, to matter beyond the roles and titles that had always defined his worth. Weeks passed like pages turning in a book whose ending remained uncertain, and in that time the Duke of Ashworth began to make changes so subtle that even he barely recognized them at first, though they accumulated like snowfall that transforms a landscape one flake at a time. For he found himself pausing before speaking to servants to ask rather than command, Listening to his steward's concerns about tenant welfare with genuine attention rather than perfunctory acknowledgement, and catching himself in moments when the old certainty rose up like a reflex, and choosing instead to consider that his perspective might be incomplete rather than absolute. Eleanor noticed these shifts with the careful observation of someone who had learned to read character in gestures and silences, but she remained guarded, her heart protected behind walls, built from too many years of watching men perform temporary kindness to achieve their aims, and though she acknowledged his efforts with polite recognition, she gave no indication that they had altered her fundamental assessment of him or softened her resolve to keep proper distance between them. It was at a charity event in early November, organized by Lady Pemberton to benefit the Foundling Hospital, that these quiet transformations were tested in ways the Duke had not anticipated, for he arrived at the modest hall in Bloomsbury with the discomfort of a man accustomed to ballrooms and state dinners, now confronted with worn wooden floors and the cheerful chaos of children in need of care and attention, and he saw Eleanor immediately, her sleeves rolled back in a manner no duchess would permit, her hair slightly disheveled from exertion, her face alight with genuine joy as she helped a small girl with a torn pinafore, and the contrast between this Eleanor and the carefully composed woman of the ballrooms struck him with the force of revelation about which version was the performance and which was the truth. He attempted to make himself useful, though his efforts were clumsy and uncertain, unused to work that required gentle hands rather than commanding presence, and he was struggling to fold linens in a manner that met the matron's exacting standards when a sudden commotion erupted near the garden door, a young boy of perhaps 7 years stumbling inside with blood streaming from a gash on his forehead, having fallen from the garden wall in some misadventure, and while others froze in alarm, Eleanor moved with swift competence that spoke of experience rather than theory, gathering the frightened child into her arms with soothing words, applying pressure to the wound with a clean cloth, her voice steady and warm as she promised him he would be well, that she would not leave him, that bravery sometimes meant letting others help us when we are hurt. The Duke watched this scene from his position across the room, watched the way she held the boy with such tenderness, the way she met his fear with calm assurance, the way she treated this orphaned child with the same dignity she might afford a prince, and something fundamental shifted in his understanding of what nobility truly meant. For here was a woman who needed no title or position to command respect, whose worth lay not in bloodlines or accomplishments, but in the simple, the profound act of seeing another human being suffering and responding with competence and compassion. And he realized with sudden clarity that everything he had been taught to value, the perfect manners, the flawless appearance, the unassailable control, were hollow performances compared to this authentic grace, this willingness to be present in someone else's moment of need without calculation or concern for how it might reflect upon one's own consequence. The turning point came on a December afternoon, when the air held that peculiar quality of winter light that makes everything appear both crystalline and fragile, and the Duke of Ashworth asked Eleanor if she would consent to walk with him in Hyde Park, his formality barely concealing an uncertainty that would have been unthinkable mere months before, and she agreed with a quiet grace that suggested she sensed this was not another of their accidental encounters, but something more deliberate, more weighted with intention and risk. They walked in silence at first along the Serpentine, their breath forming clouds in the cold air, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a rawness she had never heard before, as he said, "My father taught me that emotion was weakness, Miss Hartley, that a gentleman's worth lay in his absolute control over himself and his circumstances, that to feel deeply was to invite chaos into the ordered world he had built, and I absorbed these lessons so thoroughly that I convinced myself they were truth rather than his own fear dressed in the garments of wisdom." She turned to look at him then, this man who had always seemed carved from marble, now revealing the living flesh beneath, and she said softly, "And what do you believe now?" He was quiet for a long moment, watching the grey water of the lake reflect the grey sky above, and then he said, "I believe that I have spent my entire life constructing a fortress around myself and calling it strength, when in truth it was the most profound cowardice, the fear of being known and found wanting, and you saw through it immediately, saw that I was offering you a prison of perfection when what you deserved was the messy, difficult, beautiful reality of being truly seen." The honesty of it struck her like a physical thing, for she had spent so many years watching men perform virtue while hoarding their true selves, and here was this impossible, arrogant duke offering her something she had never expected: genuine vulnerability, the courage to admit he had been wrong, the willingness to be transformed by that admission. "I have my own fears, Your Grace," she said quietly, and in her voice he heard the echo of his own confession, the risk of speaking truth aloud. "I feared becoming invisible in someone else's perfect life, becoming nothing more than the reflection of another's requirements, losing myself so completely that I would not even remember who I had been before, and that fear was greater than any desire for security or position, or all the things young women are taught to value above themselves." They had reached a bench beneath a barren oak, and they sat without discussion, drawn by the same need for stillness in which to hold this moment of mutual revelation. And he said, attempting lightness but achieving something more genuine, "I suspect I have made rather a fool of myself these past months, pursuing you about London like a lovesick puppy when I was supposed to be an unconquerable duke." And to his astonishment and profound relief, Eleanor laughed, not the polite titter of ballroom conversation, but real laughter, warm and unguarded, that transformed her face into something radiant, and he found himself laughing with her at the absurdity of it all, at the distance he had traveled from that moment of arrogant certainty in the ballroom to this bench in winter, where nothing was certain except the strange, terrifying hope that perhaps they were beginning to understand one another. In the midst of their shared laughter, he gestured to emphasize some self-deprecating point, and his hand moved across the bench, just as hers did the same, and for the briefest instant, their fingers touched, and the contact electric and significant, despite the layers of gloves between them, and both froze, awareness crackling in the cold air like static, before simultaneously withdrawing their hands with a care that suggested they both understood the danger and the promise of that accidental intimacy. And though neither acknowledged what had passed between them, Eleanor felt her heart beating faster, and knew with sudden clarity that the walls she had built around herself were no longer quite as impenetrable as she had believed, while the Duke recognized with equal certainty that he was no longer observing this woman from a safe distance, but had somehow, without quite realizing when or how, allowed her to matter to him in ways that left him exposed and uncertain, and strangely, impossibly alive. The crisis arrived with Lady Catherine Thornbury, the Duke's formidable aunt from Derbyshire, who descended upon London like a winter storm 3 days after the walk in Hyde Park, having heard through the intricate network of family gossip that her nephew was making a spectacle of himself, pursuing a woman who had publicly refused him, and she arrived at Lady Pemberton's evening musicale with the express purpose of putting an end to what she termed this unseemly display of weakness, her imposing figure draped in black silk despite being widowed, and these 15 years, her face set in lines of permanent disapproval that suggested she found the entire world wanting and was determined to correct it through sheer force of disapprobation. Eleanor saw her enter and felt a chill of premonition, for here was everything she had feared about marrying into the Ashworth family made manifest in one person: the absolute certainty of superiority, the conviction that consequence mattered more than character, the willingness to crush anything that threatened the family's exalted position. And when Lady Catherine's cold eyes fixed upon her with an assessment that found her lacking before a single word was exchanged, Eleanor understood that whatever fragile understanding she and the Duke had been building was about to be tested in ways neither had anticipated. The Duke saw his aunt's arrival with a sinking dread born of long experience with her particular brand of tyranny, and he moved to intercept her before she could reach Eleanor. But Lady Catherine was not a woman easily diverted from her purpose, and she cut through the gathered guests with the ruthless efficiency of someone accustomed to others, clearing a path before her, arriving at Eleanor's side just as the musical performance concluded, and saying in a voice pitched to carry, "So you are the young woman who thinks herself too good for my nephew, the one who refused an offer any sensible girl would have accepted with gratitude, and now you lead him about London like a trained dog, using his infatuation to elevate your own consequence while damaging his reputation with every public appearance." The room fell silent with that peculiar quality of collective shock when society witnesses a direct attack, and Eleanor stood frozen, her face pale but her composure intact, and the Duke felt something shift inside him, like a tectonic plate finding new alignment. For here was the moment that mattered more than any declaration or gesture, the choice between the comfortable path of family loyalty and old patterns, or the terrifying vulnerability of defending what was right, regardless of cost. He stepped forward and said in a voice that carried the full weight of his title, but also something new, genuine conviction, rather than mere authority, "Aunt Catherine, you will apologize to Miss Hartley immediately, for you have insulted not only a woman of impeccable character, but also my own judgment, which I assure you is quite sound despite your apparent doubts. And if you cannot conduct yourself with the courtesy that any guest in this house deserves, regardless of their station or history with our family, then I must ask you to withdraw." Lady Catherine's face went rigid with shock, for her nephew had never contradicted her in public, had always maintained the united front of family, regardless of private disagreements. And she said with icy fury, "You would take her side against your own blood, but against the family that has given you everything you are, for a woman who publicly humiliated you?" And the Duke, feeling Eleanor's eyes upon him, feeling the weight of months of transformation and growth and painful self-examination, said quietly but firmly, "She refused an arrangement that would have been a disservice to us both, and that required courage I did not possess at the time. And yes, I choose to stand with someone who values truth over convenience, even when that means disappointing family members I have long respected but can no longer allow to dictate how I conduct myself or whom I hold in esteem." Eleanor watched this unfold with something like wonder, for here was the Duke she had glimpsed in moments, but never seen fully realized, a man willing to risk everything he had been taught to value for the sake of what was genuinely right, defending her, not with the cold calculation of political maneuvering, but with the raw honesty of someone choosing integrity over comfort. And in that moment, she felt the last of her carefully maintained reserve begin to crack like ice in spring. The thought, both terrifying and inevitable, as she recognized that this transformation was not performance, but genuine change, hard-won and imperfect, and therefore infinitely more valuable than any easy perfection could ever be. Lady Catherine departed from Lady Pemberton's musicale in a fury of rustling black silk and wounded pride, her exit marked by the sharp crack of her walking stick against the marble floor, and in the trembling silence that followed her departure, the Duke stood very still, his heart hammering beneath his perfectly tailored evening coat, as he wondered with genuine fear whether his defense of Eleanor had protected her or merely painted a larger target upon her back, for society could be cruel to those who disrupted its established hierarchies, and he had just publicly declared that this woman mattered more to him than family approval, more than the careful maintenance of consequence that had governed his entire life, until she refused him and set in motion this terrible, wonderful transformation. Eleanor approached him quietly, aware of the many eyes still upon them, and she said in a voice meant only for him, "Thank you, Your Grace, for that was the bravest thing I have witnessed in a very long time, and I know what it cost you." And he looked at her with something raw and unguarded in his grey eyes, as he replied, "I only fear I have made your situation more difficult, for my aunt is not a woman who forgives perceived slights, and she has considerable influence among certain circles." But Eleanor shook her head slightly and said, "You chose what was right over what was easy, and that is worth whatever consequences may follow." The evening continued with a strange, heightened quality, conversations resuming but with an undercurrent of speculation and reassessment, and the Duke found himself less concerned with managing society's perception than with Eleanor's quiet presence at his side, as they spoke with other guests, and when Lady Pemberton's nephew mentioned a new exhibition of scientific instruments at the Royal Society, Eleanor's eyes lit with genuine interest, and the Duke found himself truly listening as she spoke about her fascination with astronomy and the way the stars suggested both order and infinite possibility, her words painting pictures of wonder that he had never allowed himself to contemplate in his rigid worldview, where everything had its proper place and deviation was weakness. As the gathering drew toward its close and guests began to depart into the December night, the Duke noticed Eleanor reaching into her reticule for something, and then pausing with a small sound of dismay, and before he could ask what was wrong, she said, "I seem to have dropped my handkerchief somewhere. How careless of me." And he immediately began to search the vicinity where they had been standing, finding the delicate square of embroidered linen beneath a chair. and as he retrieved it and placed it in her outstretched hand, their fingers touched without the barrier of gloves this time, skin against skin for just a heartbeat, and the contact sent a current of awareness through both of them that was impossible to ignore or pretend had not happened. Eleanor's breath catching slightly, as the Duke's fingers lingered a fraction of a second longer than necessity required before withdrawing, both of them acutely conscious that something had shifted between them, that the careful distance they had maintained was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain in the face of this growing pull toward one another. They stood together in the thinning crowd, neither quite willing to be the first to step away, and the Duke found himself asking, "What would you do, Miss Hartley, if you had complete freedom to pursue your dreams without concern for society's expectations or practical limitations?" And Eleanor looked at him with surprise and something like hope as she answered, "I would open a school for girls, not just the daughters of gentlemen, but any girl who wished to learn, teaching them not merely accomplishments for attracting husbands, but real knowledge, mathematics and philosophy and literature and science, giving them the tools to think for themselves and shape their own destinies, rather than simply accepting the paths laid out for them." And instead of the dismissal or patronizing amusement she had learned to expect when sharing this dream, the Duke asked thoughtful questions about curriculum and funding and location, truly engaging with her vision as though it were not merely a foolish feminine fancy, but a serious endeavor worthy of serious consideration. And Eleanor felt something crumble inside her, another piece of the protective wall she had built around her heart, giving way before this man's patient, imperfect, utterly sincere attempt to see her not as an ornament or a duty, but as a whole person with thoughts and dreams that mattered. Autumn arrived in London with its particular melancholy beauty, the leaves turning gold and crimson in the parks, the air carrying that crisp promise of change that made Eleanor think of endings and beginnings intertwined. And in the months since Lady Catherine's dramatic departure and the Duke's public defense of her, something had shifted between them into a pattern that felt both comfortable and precarious, a genuine friendship built on honest conversation and mutual respect. Though Eleanor remained cautious about allowing her feelings to deepen beyond the careful boundaries she had established, telling herself that friendship with this transformed man was enough, that she must not mistake gratitude for his growth with something deeper and more dangerous to her carefully guarded heart. The Duke had indeed transformed, though not completely, for transformation is never a straight path but rather a winding journey with moments of backsliding and struggle, and Eleanor witnessed both his progress and his difficulties with equal clarity, the way he still sometimes reverted to pronouncements before catching himself and asking questions instead, the tension in his shoulders when situations required him to show vulnerability in front of others, the occasional flash of his old arrogance that he would recognize and apologize for with an honesty that was itself proof of change, and she found herself charmed by his imperfection in ways his earlier flawless control had never managed, for there was something deeply human in watching someone struggle to become better and choosing to keep trying despite the difficulty. They had fallen into a rhythm of regular engagements, always properly chaperoned but increasingly intimate in their conversations. And when the Duke suggested attending the theatre together to see a new production of a play about star-crossed lovers who found each other despite the machinations of fate and family, Eleanor accepted with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation, for she had begun to notice that her own feelings were becoming harder to contain, that she looked forward to their meetings with an eagerness that went beyond mere friendship, that she caught herself thinking of him at odd moments and wondering what he would say about something she had read or observed, and this growing attachment frightened her even as it drew her inexorably forward. The evening of the performance arrived with a soft rain that made the gaslit streets gleam like polished stone, and Eleanor sat beside the Duke in his box at the theatre, acutely aware of his presence in the intimate darkness as the play unfolded on the stage below, the story of two people who had to lose everything they thought they wanted in order to find what they truly needed, and as the performance reached its emotional crescendo, a scene where the hero finally admitted his love despite knowing it might cost him everything he had been raised to value, Eleanor glanced at the Duke and saw something that made her breath catch in her throat tears, quickly blinked away but unmistakably present, sliding down his composed face in the flickering stage light, and he turned slightly, catching her gaze, and for a moment made no attempt to hide his emotion before old habits reasserted themselves, and he looked away, discreetly wiping his eyes with his handkerchief. But the damage was done. Or perhaps the healing, for Eleanor had seen behind the last vestiges of his careful control to the man beneath. Someone capable of being moved by beauty and sacrifice and love. Someone who felt deeply despite years of training to suppress such dangerous vulnerabilities. And in that moment, she felt her own carefully maintained walls begin to truly crumble, the recognition washing over her like a wave that she had been fighting the truth for months now, that she was falling in love, not with who the Duke had been, or even simply who he was now, but with the courage it took to change, with the man who was still becoming himself, still learning to bend without breaking. And the realization was both terrifying and inevitable, like standing at the edge of a precipice, and knowing that the only way forward was to jump and trust that something would catch her, though whether that something would be his arms or the hard ground of disappointment, she could not yet know. The Duke sat alone in his study 3 nights after the theatre performance, the fire burning low in the grate and casting dancing shadows across the book-lined walls, and he stared at the tumbler of brandy in his hand without seeing it, his mind consumed by a truth he could no longer deny or rationalize away or dress up in more palatable language, for the simple fact was that he had fallen in love with Eleanor Hartley, not with the composed young woman he had selected as a suitable duchess all those months ago, not with some idealized vision of what she might be or what she represented, but with her true self, with her sharp mind and gentle courage and quiet laughter, and the way she looked at the world with such clear-eyed honesty that it made him want to be better than he had ever imagined he could be, and this realization terrified him more than anything he had faced in his carefully controlled life. For love required surrender in a way that even his recent transformation had not fully demanded. He rose and paced to the window, looking out at the dark garden where frost was beginning to silver the bare branches, and he felt the old instinct rising in him to retreat, to rebuild his walls, and to protect himself from this dangerous vulnerability by returning to the cold certainty that had governed him for so long, telling himself that friendship was enough, that he need not risk this terrible exposure of his heart when Eleanor had given no clear indication that she felt anything beyond polite regard for the man he was becoming, and surely it would be madness to confess these feelings and face the possibility of her gentle but firm rejection, for if her refusal had wounded his pride before, another rejection now would devastate something far deeper and more essential than mere consequence. A soft knock at the door interrupted his spiraling thoughts, and his valet, Patterson, entered with the evening's correspondence and a look of concern that suggested he had witnessed too many of these late-night vigils. For Patterson had been with the Duke since his youth and had observed the entire arc of his master's transformation with the quiet wisdom of a man who understood that true service sometimes meant speaking uncomfortable truths, and after setting down the silver tray, he said with careful deliberation, "Your Grace, if I may be so bold, I have watched you these past months become more yourself than I have ever seen you, and yet tonight you seem intent on retreating back into the fortress you have worked so hard to leave." And the Duke turned from the window with a flash of his old imperious manner before catching himself and asking instead, "What would you have me do, Patterson, when the risk of honesty feels greater than I know how to bear?" And the old valet smiled slightly and said, "Some battles, Your Grace, are won by surrender, and the greatest victory is sometimes found in laying down one's arms and trusting another with the truth of one's heart. For what is life without such risk but merely existence, and you have spent too long merely existing when you might truly live." The words settled over the Duke like a benediction and a challenge, and he stood there in the firelit study feeling the weight of his choice before him, knowing that Patterson was right, that he had come too far to turn back now, that the man he was becoming could not build a life on cowardice and self-protection when Eleanor had shown him what real courage looked like, and so he made his decision with a mixture of terror and determination, knowing that tomorrow he would speak to Eleanor with complete honesty, would tell her that he loved her with a depth that both frightened and exalted him, would risk everything on the slim hope that she might feel even a fraction of what he felt, and if she refused him again, at least this time it would be a true rejection of his genuine self, rather than the rightful dismissal of his arrogant presumption. And there was a strange peace in that thought, even as his heart hammered with anticipation of the coming confession. The Duke sent a note to Eleanor the following morning requesting that she meet him in the winter garden of his townhouse that afternoon, a choice deliberate in its privacy and symbolic weight, for the glass-enclosed sanctuary had been his mother's favorite place before her death, somewhere he rarely invited anyone, and as he waited among the frost-touched camellias and winter jasmine, watching the first delicate snowflakes begin to fall against the glass panes overhead, he found himself more nervous than he had ever been before. Any business negotiation or parliamentary debate or social engagement, his hands actually trembling slightly as he adjusted his cravat for the third time and tried to rehearse what he would say. Though every practiced phrase felt inadequate to the enormity of what he needed to confess, and when Eleanor arrived, wrapped in a deep blue pelisse with snowflakes caught like diamonds in her dark hair, he felt his carefully prepared words dissolve entirely at the sight of her quiet grace and the question in her eyes that held both warmth and wariness in equal measure. They stood facing each other amid the winter blooms, the snow falling more steadily now and creating a cocoon of white silence around the glass house. And the Duke found himself stammering like a green boy at his first assembly, rather than a man of 30 who had commanded rooms and bent society to his will, saying, "Miss Hartley, Eleanor, I asked you here because I must tell you something, and I find that I cannot do so with any of the eloquence I had hoped to muster, for you have rather thoroughly destroyed my ability to speak in polished phrases and careful constructions, which is perhaps fitting given that you have destroyed so many other certainties I once held." And he saw a flicker of something cross her face that might have been amusement or tenderness or both before he pressed on, driven by the knowledge that retreat was no longer possible, even as his voice shook with the vulnerability of what he was about to reveal. He told her then, haltingly and imperfectly, that he loved her with a depth that frightened him, that he had come to understand that his first proposal had been an act of supreme arrogance, offering her nothing real while demanding everything, and that he now stood before her with nothing to offer but his true self, flawed and still learning, and desperately hoping that she might see something worth considering in the man he was becoming rather than the perfect facade he had once presented. And he admitted that he did not know if she could ever feel for him what he felt for her, that he understood she had every reason to guard her heart against someone who had once been so certain of his right to claim her without earning that privilege, but that he had to ask, had to know if there was any possibility, however small, and that she might consider a true partnership with him, one built on mutual respect and genuine affection, and the courage to be vulnerable with each other in all the ways that terrified him, but that he now understood were essential to anything real and lasting. Eleanor stood very still during his confession, her eyes never leaving his face, and he watched her expression shift through surprise and something that might have been pain, and finally a softness that gave him a fragile thread of hope before she spoke, her voice quiet but steady as she said, "Your Grace, Alexander, I am moved by your honesty, more than you might imagine, and I see the courage it took to speak such words when you have spent your life learning to hide what you feel. But I must ask for time to think, for this is not a small thing you are asking, and I need to be certain of my own heart before I can answer you. For I will not enter into any understanding built on gratitude for your transformation rather than genuine feeling." And though her words were not the immediate acceptance he had desperately hoped for, neither were they rejection, and he found himself nodding, his throat tight with emotion as he said, "Of course, take whatever time you need, for I would rather wait a lifetime for your honest answer than receive an immediate yes given from anything less than certainty." And they stood together in the falling snow, both vulnerable and uncertain, but no longer hiding behind the masks they had worn when first they met, and when Eleanor finally took her leave, pausing to touch his hand briefly with her gloved fingers before departing, the Duke remained in the winter garden watching the snow accumulate on the glass, and feeling that whatever her answer might be, he had finally done the one thing he had never imagined himself capable of. He had surrendered completely, had laid his heart bare without any guarantee of victory, and there was a strange peace in that terrible honesty, a sense that regardless of the outcome, he had finally learned what it meant to truly risk everything for something that mattered more than pride or position or the careful control that had governed him for so long. Eleanor sat in the drawing room of her father's townhouse 3 days after the Duke's confession, her embroidery lying forgotten in her lap as she stared at the winter rain streaking down the windows and tried to untangle the complicated knot of feelings that had kept her awake these past nights. For Alexander's words in the winter garden had moved her more deeply than she had expected. his vulnerability and imperfect honesty, touching something in her heart that she had carefully guarded since the day she had refused his first cold proposal. And yet she found herself afraid to trust what she felt, uncertain whether her growing affection was born of genuine love or merely gratitude for his transformation, or worse, some treacherous hope that she could be the exception to prove that people could truly change when she had seen so many return to their essential natures once the initial effort of reformation had faded. Her father found her there in the afternoon gloom and settled into the chair across from her with the gentle concern that had characterized his care since her mother's death 5 years earlier. And without preamble, he said, "You are thinking of the Duke's declaration and wondering whether you can trust what your heart is telling you." And Eleanor looked up at him with eyes that felt too bright and nodded, saying, "Papa, I have watched him change these past months, seen him struggle against everything his upbringing taught him about power and control and the proper distance a man of his station should maintain, and I believe his transformation is real, but how can I be certain it will last? How can I know that in 5 years or 10, he will not revert to the cold certainty that governed him before, leaving me trapped in exactly the arrangement I refused the first time?" And her father was quiet for a long moment before responding, "My dear girl, there are no certainties in matters of the heart, and anyone who claims otherwise is either a fool or a liar. But I will tell you what I have observed in my years, which is that true change is recognized not by its perfection but by its persistence, not by the absence of struggle, but by the willingness to keep struggling, even when it would be easier to surrender to old patterns. And this Duke of yours, he fights himself daily. I have seen it in his eyes when his pride rises up, and he must consciously choose humility, and that choice, made over and over, is worth more than any easy grace could ever be." Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks at her father's words, recognizing the truth in them, even as her fear persisted, and she spent the following day walking through the city she loved, retracing the path of her acquaintance with Alexander, and remembering the small moments that had marked his gradual unbending, the way his eyes had softened when she spoke of her dreams, the genuine interest he had shown in her thoughts, rather than simply waiting for his turn to pronounce judgment, the careful attention he paid to her comfort and preferences as though they mattered as much as his own. And she found herself at last in the bookshop where they had first truly conversed, that dusty sanctuary that smelled of leather and paper and possibility. And as she browsed the philosophy section, where he had purchased the volume on humility all those months ago, her fingers encountered a slim book that seemed slightly out of place, and when she pulled it from the shelf, a folded paper fell from between its pages, her name written on it in Alexander's precise hand. She opened the note with trembling fingers and read words that must have been written weeks ago, perhaps even before the theater performance that had begun the final shift in her own guarded heart. And he had written simply but devastatingly, "Eleanor, I leave this here knowing you may never find it, but needing to tell you, even in this cowardly hidden way, that you have become the measure against which I judge my own worth. The voice in my head that asks whether I am being my best self or merely my most comfortable one, and I do not know if I will ever be brave enough to tell you that I love you. But if I am not, at least these words will exist somewhere in the world, as testimony that you changed me in ways I did not know I needed to be changed." And Eleanor stood there in the quiet bookshop with tears streaming down her face, clutching this evidence of vulnerability he had shown, even when he thought no one would witness it. And she knew then with absolute certainty that her answer would be yes, and that she loved not just who he had become, but who they might become together. Two imperfect people, brave enough to risk everything on the terrifying hope that love might be worth the surrender of safety. Eleanor sent the note to Alexander the morning after finding his hidden letter in the bookshop, requesting that he meet her at the museum where they had once stood before a Renaissance painting, discussing the nature of beauty and vulnerability. And she chose that location with deliberate symbolism, remembering how he had struggled then to understand her assertion that perfection was less compelling than honest imperfection. And as she waited in the gallery devoted to Dutch masters, with their scenes of domestic intimacy and careful attention to ordinary light, she rehearsed what she wanted to say while her heart beat an anxious rhythm against her ribs, for this was no small thing she was about to offer, no safe choice, but rather a leap into uncertainty with a man who had once embodied everything she feared, and who now represented a hope that terrified her precisely because she wanted it so desperately. Alexander arrived exactly at the appointed hour, and Eleanor saw immediately in the careful control of his expression and the tension in his shoulders that he was trying to hide profound anxiety, that he had spent these days of her silence convincing himself that her answer would be no, and preparing to accept that rejection with whatever grace he could muster, and the sight of his vulnerability, so hard-won and so carefully concealed behind the remnants of his ducal bearing, made her heart ache with tenderness, even as it strengthened her resolve. For she understood now that loving him meant witnessing his struggles as well as his victories, accepting that transformation was not a destination, but a continuous journey that would require patience and faith from both of them. She led him to stand before a vermeer, a small painting of a woman reading a letter by a window, light falling across her absorbed face with such gentle truth that it seemed to capture the very essence of private emotion made visible. And Eleanor said quietly, "I found your note yesterday, the one you left in the bookshop weeks ago, and I have been carrying it with me ever since, reading your words over and over because they showed me something I needed to see." And she watched his eyes widen with recognition and what might have been embarrassment before she continued, "Alexander, I have spent these days since your confession in the winter garden, examining my own heart with as much honesty as I could bear, asking myself whether what I feel for you is real or merely the romance of watching someone change. And I realized that my fear of trusting you was less about doubting your transformation than about my own terror of surrendering the safety I have built around my heart. For loving you means risking everything on the belief that two imperfect people can build something true together." She saw him draw a sharp breath, hope and fear warring in his expression as she went on, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "I do not love who you were when you first proposed to me with such cold certainty, nor do I love only who you have become in these months of struggling against everything you were taught about power and control, but rather I love who we might become together, the partnership we could build if we are both brave enough to keep choosing vulnerability over safety, honesty over perfection. And I truly believe, that you are worth that risk, but that we are worth that risk." And before she could say more, Alexander closed the distance between them with 2 swift steps and took her hands in his grip almost too tight, and his voice breaking as he said, "Eleanor, I do not have adequate words for what your trust means to me, and for the gift you are offering, when I know I have given you every reason to guard your heart against me." And she saw tears on his face that he made no attempt to hide. This man who had once treated emotion as weakness, now standing in a public gallery, letting his joy and relief show plainly, and she found herself laughing even as she cried, saying, "Then perhaps we need no more words for now." And when he kissed her, it was tender and hesitant and utterly real, his hands cradling her face with a gentleness that spoke of reverence and wonder. And Eleanor felt something in her chest unfold, like a flower finally touched by sun after a long winter, the last of her careful defenses dissolving in the warmth of this imperfect, honest, hard-won love. Alexander called upon Eleanor's father the following afternoon with a formality that barely concealed his nervousness. And when Mr. Hartley received him in the library with its smell of old leather and pipe tobacco, the Duke found himself momentarily returned to the careful protocols of his upbringing, before remembering that this was not a business transaction, but rather the most important request he would ever make, and so he set aside the practiced speech he had rehearsed, and spoke instead from the uncertain territory of his heart, saying, "Mr. Hartley, I come to ask your permission to marry your daughter, and I know I have no right to expect your blessing given how poorly I conducted myself when first I sought Eleanor's hand. But I hope that you have seen in these past months that I am no longer the man who believed a title and fortune were sufficient grounds for marriage, and I want you to know that I love Eleanor with a depth that terrifies me, precisely because it matters so profoundly, and I swear to you that I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the gift she is offering me in her trust." Mr. Hartley regarded him with the same gentle wisdom Eleanor had inherited and said simply, "Your Grace, I have indeed watched your transformation, and more importantly, I have watched my daughter come alive in ways I had not seen since her mother's death. For Eleanor has always been one who needed a partner who could match her strength rather than diminish it, and I believe you have learned to do exactly that. So yes, you have my blessing and my hope that you will continue to choose growth over comfort for all your days together." Alexander felt relief wash through him so powerfully that his hands trembled slightly as he shook Mr. Hartley's hand, and then Eleanor was there in the doorway where she had been waiting with her younger sister, her eyes bright with anticipation and perhaps the faintest trace of mischief, and Alexander crossed to her with his heart in his throat and took her hands in his, saying, "Eleanor, I asked you once before to be my Duchess, and I did it with arrogance and certainty, and absolutely no understanding of what I was truly asking. But today I ask you again, with full knowledge of my own inadequacy and profound gratitude for your willingness to see past who I was to who I might become. And I am asking not that you accept a position, but that you enter into a partnership, not that you grace my home, but that you share my life with all its struggles and imperfections. And I promise you that I will listen when you speak, value your dreams as equal to my own, stand beside you rather than expect you to walk behind, and love you, not for your breeding or your beauty or your quiet grace, but for the fierce honesty and courage that first drew me to examine my own failings." He reached into his pocket and produced a ring, and Eleanor saw immediately that it was not the massive Ashworth heirloom with its ostentatious diamonds that would have been expected for a duchess, but rather a delicate band of gold set with sapphires, the exact color of her eyes. And Alexander said with touching uncertainty, "I chose this myself because I wanted you to have something that was selected for you alone and not merely inherited. But if you would prefer something else, if you wish to choose your own ring or design something entirely new, I will wait as long as necessary." And Eleanor laughed then, a sound of pure joy that filled the library like light. And she said, "Alexander, it is perfect. You are perfect in your very imperfection. And yes, yes, I will marry you and build this partnership with you and trust in what we can become together." And, as he slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that shook slightly despite his best efforts at control, her father and sister watching with undisguised happiness, Alexander understood that this moment of vulnerability and honest joy was worth more than all the cold certainty that had governed his previous life. And when Eleanor rose on her toes to kiss him with her family as witnesses to this new beginning, he felt the last remnants of his old self fall away like armor he no longer needed, replaced by something far more frightening and infinitely more precious, the terrifying freedom of being fully known and choosing to be loved anyway. The wedding preparations unfolded over the following weeks, in a manner that would have astonished the Duke of Ashworth, who had first proposed to Eleanor with such cold certainty. For instead of the grand spectacle that society would have expected from a ducal wedding, Alexander found himself deferring to Eleanor's preferences at every turn, and more remarkably, discovering that he genuinely wanted her vision rather than the traditional display of wealth and power that his position demanded. And their first disagreement arose over the guest list when his secretary presented the expected roster of 300 names, including distant relatives Alexander barely knew, and political connections he was obligated to honor. And Eleanor looked at the list with dismay and said quietly, "This is not a wedding, Alexander. It is a state occasion. And I had hoped we might celebrate with those who actually care for us rather than those who merely wish to be seen." And he felt his old instinct rise to defend tradition and obligation before remembering that this was precisely the kind of moment that defined their partnership. And so, instead of dismissing her concerns, he sat with her in his study, and they worked through the list together, crossing off names and adding others until they had created something that honored both his responsibilities and her desire for intimacy, a compromise of 150 guests that felt right to them both. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, arrived from the dower house with expectations of controlling the arrangements, as she had controlled everything in Alexander's life until Eleanor entered it, and the first dinner with both women present became a careful dance of wills, as his mother criticized Eleanor's choice of flowers as too simple, her preference for a string quartet over a full orchestra as insufficient, her plan to include several of Alexander's servants in the guest list as absolutely improper, and Alexander watched Eleanor handle each criticism with a grace that amazed him, never defensive, but also never yielding on what mattered to her, explaining her choices with such quiet conviction that even his mother found herself occasionally conceding points, though she maintained an air of wounded disapproval that Alexander knew was meant to make him feel guilty for choosing his bride's happiness over his mother's pride. The true crisis came when his mother discovered that Eleanor intended to use a portion of the settlement Alexander had given her to establish the school for girls they had discussed, and she declared at dinner before several relatives that it was unseemly for a duchess to involve herself in such matters, that Eleanor's proper role was to manage Alexander's household and produce heirs rather than waste time and money on educating girls who would only become governesses or worse, and Alexander felt the old familiar pressure to maintain family harmony by staying silent. But then he looked at Eleanor's face and saw not hurt, but rather a calm waiting, a quiet faith that he would choose rightly, and he set down his wineglass with deliberate care and said, "Mother, I understand that you come from a generation that believed a woman's sphere should be limited to domestic concerns, but I have learned from Eleanor that true nobility lies in using one's position to lift others rather than merely maintaining one's own status. And I am proud that my wife wishes to create opportunities for girls who would otherwise have none, and I will not only support her in this endeavor, but actively assist her in making it succeed, and I must ask that you either offer your support as well or keep your opposition private, for I will not allow anyone, family or otherwise, to diminish Eleanor's vision or make her feel unwelcome in what will soon be her home as much as mine." The silence that followed his declaration was profound, and his mother's face showed shock that her son would speak to her thus, but Eleanor reached under the table and squeezed his hand with a pressure that told him she understood the cost of his words and valued his defense, and though his mother left the next day with stiff formality and barely concealed anger, Alexander felt no regret, only a deep certainty that he had finally learned to choose correctly between the approval of others and the partnership he was building with Eleanor. As the wedding day approached, both found themselves seized by unexpected nervousness, and 3 nights before the ceremony, Eleanor came to him in his study, where he was pretending to review estate papers, but actually wrestling with doubts about whether he could truly be the husband she deserved, and she sat beside him and said, "I am terrified, Alexander, terrified that I will wake one morning and find you have reverted to the cold duke who first proposed to me, or worse, in that my own fears will make me retreat into the quiet invisibility I used to hide behind." And he took her hands and admitted, "I share that fear, for I know my transformation is not complete, and perhaps never will be, and I worry that I will fail you in some crucial moment, that my old habits will resurface and hurt you before I even realize what I have done." And they sat together in the firelight, acknowledging their fears and making promises not of perfection but of effort, agreeing that they would speak honestly when one hurt the other, that they would assume good intent even in moments of conflict, that they would choose each day to build their partnership rather than retreat into self-protection. And as Eleanor left his study that night with a kiss that tasted of salt from tears neither was ashamed to shed, Alexander understood that this honest vulnerability was itself a kind of wedding vow, perhaps more binding than any words they would speak before witnesses in 3 days' time. The morning of the wedding arrived, with autumn sunlight filtering through golden leaves, and the chapel Alexander had chosen was not the grand cathedral where generations of Ashworth dukes had married, but rather a smaller Norman church on the estate, where Eleanor had said she felt the presence of something eternal and true. And as guests arrived in smaller numbers than society expected, but with genuine warmth that no grand spectacle could have commanded, the stone walls seemed to hold their anticipation like a benediction, and inside the space glowed with the soft light of hundreds of candles that Eleanor had insisted upon, because she said candlelight made everyone beautiful in their vulnerability, and the flowers were not the formal arrangements his mother would have demanded, but rather loose gatherings of autumn blooms, chrysanthemums in rust and gold, branches of turning leaves, late roses that still held summer's memory, all arranged by Eleanor and her sister with their own hands in a labor of love that made each imperfect bouquet more precious than any professional display could have been. Alexander stood at the altar in his morning coat, with his hands clasped behind his back to hide their trembling, and his closest friend, who stood as witness, noted with amusement that the unshakable Duke of Ashworth looked very much like a man who feared he might wake from a dream, and when the music began and Eleanor appeared at the far end of the chapel on her father's arm, Alexander felt his breath catch in his throat because she was not wearing the Ashworth family veil or carrying the traditional orange blossoms, but instead had chosen simple elegance, a dress of ivory silk that moved like water her mother's pearl necklace at her throat, and in her hair a coronet of the same autumn flowers that graced the chapel, and she looked so completely herself, so radiantly real rather than performing the role of duchess, that Alexander felt tears prick his eyes and did not bother to hide them as he once would have. As Eleanor reached the altar and her father placed her hand in Alexander's with a whispered blessing, she looked up at the man she was about to marry and saw in his face such open emotion that she knew without doubt that this was nothing like that first proposal in the ballroom. And when the vicar began the ceremony and they turned to face each other to speak their vows, Alexander's voice shook slightly on the words, "I, Alexander, take thee, Eleanor," and she steadied him with the pressure of her hands in his and the strength in her own voice as she promised to honor and cherish him. And in the moment when he was instructed to place the ring on her finger, his hands trembled so much that she had to help guide the band of sapphires onto her hand, and she reached up then without thinking to straighten his cravat, which had gone slightly askew, a gesture so natural and affectionate that several guests smiled through tears at the intimacy of it. During the prayers that followed, Alexander reached for Eleanor's hand in a breach of protocol that the old duke would never have committed, and she laced her fingers through his and held tight, and when they were finally pronounced husband and wife, and he was permitted to kiss his bride, he cupped her face in his hands with such tenderness that the kiss they shared was less a social formality than a private conversation witnessed by others, and the applause that erupted was not the polite acknowledgement of duty fulfilled, but rather genuine celebration of two people who had found each other through the ruins of pride and emerged transformed. The wedding breakfast that followed was held in the conservatory rather than the formal dining room, and instead of the rigid seating arrangements that tradition demanded, Eleanor had created an atmosphere that encouraged mingling and genuine conversation, and Alexander watched his wife move through their guests with such grace and warmth that several people commented they had never seen a duchess so utterly without pretension. And when they finally took to the floor for their first dance as husband and wife, he pulled her close enough to whisper, "I am grateful every day that you refused me that first time, for it gave me the chance to become someone worthy of this moment." And Eleanor smiled up at him with eyes that held both joy and the faintest trace of mischief, and replied, "And I am grateful you were stubborn enough to pursue understanding rather than nurse your wounded pride, for it gave me the chance to discover that beneath the cold duke was a man capable of extraordinary transformation." And they danced together as the afternoon light turned golden, and their guests watched with the knowledge that they were witnessing not a social triumph but something far more rare, a partnership built on truth and vulnerability and the courage to choose growth over comfort. And when they departed early, amid warm farewells and knowing smiles, Eleanor's hand secure in Alexander's as they climbed into the carriage that would take them to begin their married life, both carried with them the certainty that what they had built together through patience and honesty was more valuable than any arrangement could ever have been, a foundation strong enough to support whatever joys and challenges the years ahead might bring. 3 years had passed since that autumn wedding, and on a bright May morning the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth stood together in the garden of what had once been an abandoned manor house on the edge of London, but was now the Hartley School for girls, its windows gleaming with fresh paint and its grounds alive with the laughter of 40 students whose families could never have afforded such education. And Alexander watched his wife move among the gathered guests and benefactors with the same grace she had shown in every moment of their marriage, explaining her vision for expanding the curriculum to include not just reading and arithmetic, but also literature and science, and the kind of critical thinking that would allow these girls to shape their own futures rather than simply accept the limitations society imposed upon them. And he felt the now familiar swell of pride that no longer embarrassed him as it once would have, for Eleanor had taught him that loving someone meant celebrating their triumphs rather than fearing how their light might diminish his own. A small hand tugged at his coat and he looked down to find their daughter Catherine, not yet 2 years old, holding up a flower she had pulled from the garden with more enthusiasm than skill. And he knelt without thought for the grass stains on his expensive trousers and accepted the mangled bloom as though it were the finest rose, kissing her dark curls and thinking how his own father would have been horrified to see a duke playing nursemaid. But Alexander had learned that the opinions of ghosts mattered far less than the love of living souls. And when Eleanor caught his eye across the garden and smiled at the sight of him with their daughter, he felt a contentment so complete that it seemed impossible he had once believed. Happiness lay in control and certainty, rather than in this beautiful chaos of partnership and growth. The dedication ceremony began with Eleanor speaking to the assembled crowd about the importance of education as a path to independence, and Alexander stood beside her not as the duke who had funded the school's creation, but as her husband and partner. And when she introduced him and asked him to say a few words, he spoke not of his own generosity, but of how his wife had taught him that true nobility meant using privilege to create opportunity. And several people in the crowd who had known the old Alexander saw in his face and bearing the evidence of a transformation so complete that it seemed almost miraculous. Though those who knew the full story understood it had been earned through years of patient effort and Eleanor's unwavering belief that people could change if they chose courage over comfort. After the ceremony, as guests mingled and explored the school's bright classrooms, Alexander and Eleanor found a quiet moment together beneath an oak tree, where Catherine played with a visiting child and Eleanor leaned against her husband's shoulder with the ease of long intimacy and said, "Do you ever think about that night in the ballroom when I refused you?" And Alexander laughed softly and replied, "Every day, and every day, I thank God for your courage, for if you had accepted me, then I would have made us both miserable, and I would never have learned what it means to truly love someone." And they stood together in the dappled sunlight, watching their daughter and the students who represented Eleanor's vision made real, and the contentment between them was not the fragile piece of conflict avoided, but rather the deep security of two people who had learned to be honest with each other, even when honesty was difficult, who had chosen again and again to build something together rather than retreat into self-protection. Dear listener, perhaps you have found yourself in a moment where something appears perfect on the surface, where every practical consideration suggests acceptance, where refusal seems like madness that will cost you dearly, and yet some quiet voice within whispers that perfection without presence is merely a beautiful cage. And if this is your moment, then let Eleanor's courage remind you that it is better to face uncertainty alone than to lose yourself in someone else's carefully controlled world. And if instead you have been the one offering arrangements rather than partnerships, demanding compliance rather than inviting collaboration, then let Alexander's transformation show you that it is never too late to choose vulnerability over control, to ask questions rather than issue pronouncements, to build something real rather than maintain something merely impressive. For true partnership requires the courage to be seen in all our imperfection, to admit when we are wrong, to grow even when growth is uncomfortable, and to choose each day to honor the humanity of those we love rather than treat them as pieces in our perfectly arranged lives. May you find the wisdom to know when to refuse what looks right but feels wrong, and the humility to change when you discover your certainty was merely pride. May you build partnerships that honor both souls rather than elevate one at the expense of the other. May you rest in the knowledge that transformation, though difficult, is always possible for those brave enough to begin. This has been a story from Enchanted Chronicles, and if it has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and share it with someone who needs to remember that the best love stories are not about finding perfection, but about two imperfect people choosing again and again to grow together.